The price of the dollar is falling rapidly despite the measures of the Federal Reserve, and the statements of its president and other directives are ignored by a market that anticipates that expansionary monetary policy could return very soon, and with a great money printing, stimulate the economy, but send the value of this currency into an abyss from which it may not recover. During the last few months, the dollar has had one of the steepest falls in recent years and has lost value compared to the main world currencies, raw materials, and cryptocurrencies, thus erasing a large part of the bullish movement that held most of 2022. But why was this point reached if inflation slowed down, rates are in the highest range of the last 15 years, the technical recession has been overcome, and economic growth for 2022 was 2.9%? There are two reasons. The first one is positive. 2022 began being extremely chaotic, with high inflation, war, energy crisis, zero COVID in China, economic slowdown, among many other events that created a perfect storm that threatened the world with a deep crisis. And the dollar, as a safe haven currency, absorbed a large amount of inflows that caused part of its price increase. However, and although there are still very worrying things that 2023 inherits from 2022, now the markets have a more optimistic perspective thanks to the combination of various events, such as a warm autumn and winter in Europe that have caused the prices of energy to reach levels similar to those they had before the invasion in Ukraine, and has also allowed them to have more natural gas for the production of fertilizers. There is also the fact that China has announced the end of its zero-COVID policy and has shown signs of refocusing on growth. And inflation is slowing down around the world, among other positive events. And this has caused that the money that took refuge in the dollar have gradually returned to its origins, making its price to fall, as has been reflected in increases in most of the main stock markets, the euro, yen, pound, yuan, and even in cryptocurrencies. But this, of course, is only part of the story, and it is not the most significant, because if the negative reason did not exist, the dollar could still be going up. The negative reason is because the market hopes that the Federal Reserve will not continue with its monetary policy, it will stop raising rates, and as soon as it has a valid excuse like an increase in unemployment or an economic recession, will restart the dollar printing to stimulate the economy, diluting its purchasing power and causing it to lose value. And the market is basing these expectations on the information that the Federal Reserve itself provides, with projections that rates would begin to fall as soon as next year and settle at 2.5% in the long term. And despite the constant interviews and headlines where the president and other board members of the Fed assure that they want to keep rates high for a long period of time, the information that this institution has revealed and the way in which the market has interpreted it says something very different. This can be seen reflected in the prices of Treasury bonds, which have risen in price and their interest rates have fallen, with the yield in 5-year bonds falling from 4.5% to 3.7%, for example, indicating that the long-term rate that the market estimated to value these bonds has dropped compared to October, despite the Fed's comments. But if lowering rates is normal when inflation has slowed, why is this negative? The main fear that dozens of analysts have expressed is that victory is being claimed too soon in the fight against inflation, and it will happen the same thing as in the 70s, where there were 3 cycles with increasingly higher inflation levels, which also required increasingly high rates of interest to fight it. First, the rates were raised to 9%. They were lowered when it was thought that inflation had been overcome, and when it was not, they were raised to 13%. The same thing happened again, and this time it was necessary to raise rates to levels close to 20%, in a historical event that served to end inflation. But obviously, interest rates at that level led the country into a severe economic recession.
The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done.
And although Powell acknowledges this mistake and assures that it will not be made again, the market simply does not believe him, and the political landscape has changed radically, with the option of excessively high interest rates to face a second wave of inflation being perhaps impossible right now, due to the high levels of debt in the United States, which had more room for maneuver in the 70s, when the debt was less than 40% of the economy than right now that is above 120%.
When Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds. That was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without an interference from the politicians were very unusual. And I think in 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession.
But why doesn't the market believe that the Fed will do the right thing? There are very few institutions in America more questioned than the Federal Reserve, and from the Great Depression in 1929 to the Great Recession in 2008, a great deal of America's economic problems can be traced to Federal Reserve policies or mistakes. And, although for the moment the Federal Reserve has been doing its job and reducing its balance sheet, and the amount of dollars in the economy has fallen in recent months, or in other words, the Fed has been doing the opposite of printing money, the market is moved many times more by expectations than by the present moment, and these expectations are that the Federal Reserve will print money again. And a whole generation of investors and analysts who grew up with a pro-market Fed find it very difficult to conceive of a Federal Reserve that is willing to bear a recession and market crash to fix inflation. But a couple of clarifications don't hurt. The first is that it is not impossible for the Federal Reserve to maintain its position with higher rates for a prudent period of time to ensure that inflation has stopped and avoid the same mistakes of the past. This can happen either because it recognizes the mistakes of the past or because circumstances change and inflation exceeds expectations again, causing the Federal Reserve to stay on course. This can be due to a greater demand for raw materials from China and an increase in the general demand from their citizens now that COVID-0 is over. And also because the expectations that the market has influence what the Fed will do, because they can be inflationary. First, because of the wealth effect. That occurs when people spend more because their wealth increases, which is what could happen if the stock market continues to rise. More demand that is not offset by more production causes prices to rise. Second, because a falling dollar is making imports more expensive for Americans. Both causing headaches for the Fed, who although is trying to get the market to change expectations, is not succeeding. The second clarification is that the fall in the price of the dollar is different from announcing its end, and its position as a reserve currency remains strong so far, even a year after having confiscated Russia's international reserves and after Xi Jinping's approaches to countries like Saudi Arabia to buy crude oil in yuan. And according to the latest available report, 60% of the international reserves of the world's central banks are in dollars, 3 times those of the second reserve currency, the euro, and more than 20 times those in yuan. But this status will largely depend on the Federal Reserve being right, the US raising the debt ceiling, and China either individually or through the BRICS failing to hurt the dollar. And the third clarification, which is worth making, is that it is important to remember that currencies are extremely volatile and difficult to predict, and in a couple of months this situation could be very different. This is not the first complex situation that the dollar has experienced, and it probably will not be the last either. If you found this information helpful, you may also enjoy this video. See you next time.